Good afternoon and welcome to our audience. My name is Sushma Raman. I'm the Executive Director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. It's my pleasure and honor to welcome you today on behalf of the center and our faculty director, Matthias Riese, to Erica Chenoweth's book launch on civil resistance. Many of you might be familiar with Erica's work and scholarship. Erica is the Frank Stanton Professor of the First Amendment at Harvard Kennedy School and a professor at the Radcliffe Institute. Erica directs the Nonviolent Action Lab at the Carr Center, where they study political violence and alternatives. Foreign Policy magazine ranked Chenoweth among the top 100 global thinkers in 2013 for their efforts to promote the empirical study of nonviolent resistance. We're going to hear briefly from Erica about their work, their research, and this recent book. And then we're going to hear from a distinguished group of colleagues, and I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak. We're going to hear first from Erica Andiola, who is a really formidable advocate for immigrants and refugees. She's the Chief Advocacy Officer for Raíces and former press secretary for Latino Outreach for Bernie Sanders 2016. She started her community organizing experience when she co-founded the Arizona Dream Act Coalition. We'll next hear from Professor Cornell Brooks, who's the Hauser Professor of Practice of Nonprofit Organizations and Professor of Practice of Public Leadership and Social Justice at the Kennedy School. He's also Director of the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice and visiting Professor of the Practice of Prophetic Religion and Public Leadership at the Divinity School. He's the former President and CEO of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. We'll next hopefully hear from Alice Driver, who will be joining us from Mexico City. She's a writer based in Mexico, whose long-form reporting, radio, and essays have appeared in the New York Times, National Geographic, the New York Review of Books, and among others. She works on projects in the US and Latin America, reporting in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. We'll then hear from Bina Nepram, who is a fellow, a scholar at risk at the Carr Center. She's an Indigenous scholar and women human rights defender whose work focuses on deepening democracy and championing women-led peace, security, and disarmament in Manipur in Northeast India and South Asia. She's the founder of 3 organizations, the Manipur Women Gun Survivors Network, the Control Arms Foundation of India, and the Global Alliance of Indigenous Peoples, Gender, Justice, and Peace. And finally, we'll hear from Hardy Merriman, who's the president and CEO of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. He's worked in the field of civil resistance for over 18 years, presenting at workshops for activists and organizers around the world. So over to you, Erica.
Great, thank you so much, Sushma, Matthias, and colleagues for supporting this event, and especially for the co-panelists here, many of whom are people, all of whom are people I deeply admire, and many of whom are people that I've worked with over the years, and some of whom I've gotten to know more recently. But it's just a real honor, privilege, and delight to share some time with you talking about these ideas. I just wanted to start by saying just 2 reasons that motivated this book. The first is the kind of predominant belief that civil resistance, where unarmed people can transform power relationships by using various forms of nonviolent action, is a futile or powerless technique. In other words, pushing back on critiques that people power or nonviolent resistance never works. But I also wanted to push back on the more optimistic view that when people use nonviolent resistance, they always win. We definitely know that that's also not true. And fortunately, over the past really 15 years, there's really been kind of a renaissance in the field of civil resistance scholarship. There have been many different generations of scholarship out there that help us to understand where and how people power movements have existed, and some really important theories and frameworks for understanding how and where it works. Like I said, the field had something of a more recent kind of renaissance that has provided much more detailed data, many more cases, and an awful lot more experience of people around the world in using these techniques. And so what this book tries to do is really synthesize what it is that we can learn from people's experience that everyone else needs to know. And so the book is called Civil Resistance, What Everyone Needs to Know. It is not civil resistance, everything that is known. It is supposed to be an accessible, easy to read overview, and in fact is written in a Q&A format. It is a conversation starter, but it doesn't have everything there is to say about this topic. There's a lot that's left out. And I think the key points that the book tries to put across is, first of all, that even though it doesn't always work, civil resistance works much more than its detractors want us to believe. The second point is that even though the incidence of civil resistance campaigns have been increasing around the world over the past 50 years, the success rates have been declining, in large part, I think, because of a couple of key trends and patterns in the ways that movements are organized and the ways that that governments and counter movements have learned to respond to them. And so, really the book is trying to provide some key takeaways that anyone would want to know that would make them feel more equipped to make sense of the world we live in today, the many different types of movements and techniques that movements use around the world today to try to transform power relationships. And to that end, I hope that it adds something to the conversation. So without further ado, what I'm really excited about is to hear from Erica, Hardy, Cornell, Bina, and Alice, and from the audience who's so graciously joining in for this conversation. So I'll turn it over. Thanks. I think it's over to Erika.
Thank you. I'm so sorry. All right. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. I am so excited to have this conversation and to just look deeper into the power of civil resistance. And I could share a little bit about just my own story and experience, mostly within the immigrant rights movement. And mostly zeroing in the movement of the undocumented youth that we created 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago now, and how that really shaped a lot of the conversation now on immigration. I started organizing when I was really young in college as an undocumented student, and the biggest driver for me to want to organize was Arizona really becoming one of the states that was basically the lab for anti-immigrants, right? To start here, wanting to basically not just wanting to, but actually passing anti-immigrant laws like SB 1070, which was a law that required the police to ask for documentation to anyone who they believed was undocumented. And obviously that was mostly brown and Black people. It started with that, started with a lot of other laws that affected my family very, very directly. And as a student, I basically got notified that I was losing all my financial aid. And I was now being asked to pay out-of-state tuition because I was undocumented. So that really woke me up and made me realize, right, that I needed to do something about it. And it wasn't, I wasn't the only person in the school who was going through this. And I was really, really grateful that I was able to find a group of other students who were going through the same challenges that I was going through as an undocumented person. And that's really how a lot of the movement here in Arizona began with what now you all might know as Dreamers, right? That wasn't the name that we were called back then. We were called many other things by the media, by politicians. And it was very important for us to acknowledge that the reason why many of us and our families were being targeted, not just in Arizona, but across the country, was because of the public narrative and the public perception of who was an undocumented person, right? The way that we were portrayed and talked about, illegal aliens, criminals, I mean, you name it. I think you're still hearing a lot of those words coming from from some of the players in the media and political figures. And for us, it was important to start with that and understand that the way for us to change that was to engage in civil resistance. And this is non-citizens. This is people who grew up in the United States and who had absolutely no right to vote, or had no ability to participate in the political in politics in that way as voters. We were not. So what we did was we started coming out of the shadows and really inspired by other movements like the LGBTQ movement, who came out of the closet, right? And back in the day, we came out of the shadows. We were inspired by Dr. King and a lot of the incredible work that SNCC and other amazing organizers had done before us, right, in the civil rights movement. And we started engaging in civil disobedience actions, basically sitting down in the offices of congressional members who said that they supported us. And at the end of the day, they were voting against us, right, in Congress. We would go to their offices. We would sit down there and say, listen, if you think I should be here, then allow for me to have a path to citizenship, pass the DREAM Act, and if not, deport me. We would sit there and we would say, deport me if you really think I shouldn't be here. And that created such a big change in the narrative. And eventually we were able to, really confront not just the media, but the public in our own humanity, and paint that moral dilemma in their minds of who we were as human beings. And I'm gonna stop there because I know there's so many other people who are gonna be talking, who are amazing. And just end with how important I think for us as dreamers, as people in the immigrant rights movement have been, even as non-citizens, to figure out a way to use civil resistance to change the narrative in our lives.
So first of all, let me just begin with a word of appreciation to our panelists, the Carr Center, and of course, Professor Chenoweth for bringing us this incredible book and an incredible moment. So inspired by Erica, I just want to begin with a word of autobiographical transparency. So I come to this book as a fourth generation minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. I come to this book having led the largest civil rights organization in the country, but I also come to this work as someone who's wrestled with the question of whether or not passive resistance, civil disobedience, civil resistance is effective. I come to the book as someone who has been characteristic, idealistic, optimistic, but occasionally pessimistic and skeptical in terms of the efficacy of nonviolence, and someone who's been responsible for asking people to put their lives, their liberties, their reputations, and their credibility on the line in terms of getting arrested. So like Erica, I don't come to this text from a purely theoretical perspective. Now, having said that, I just want to note that a book entitled Civil Resistance, what everyone needs to know, could not be more tragically, propitiously timed, right? So in the wake of the George Floyd video, which invoked the Emmett Till photograph from 1955, in the wake of at least 25 million Americans hitting the streets in 550 jurisdictions across the length and breadth of our country, in the midst of the Derek Chauvin trial, in the midst of the Deontay Wright civil unrest, we as a country are literally wrestling with the text, the subtext, the index, the table of contents, and everything in this book. Why? Because it speaks to, with an empirical authority and a moral credibility as to whether or not what it is that we hope works does in fact work. So the fact that Professor Chenoweth speaks to the rule of 3.5%, that it only takes a little to accomplish a lot. This is incredibly important. It reminds me as a preacher that in the book of Judges, right, Gideon started off with an army of in excess of 30,000, and God asked him to whittle the army down to 300. So for those who are charged with the responsibility of confronting injustice, racism, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, hate crime, the environmental crisis in this moment, that's incredibly important. But this book is also a cautionary note. It's a cautionary note in that it speaks to the fact that though we have more civil resistance, we have many more movements in the first 2 decades of this 20th century than we had in the previous 100 years. It also speaks to what she calls the smart authoritarianism, or what they call the smart authoritarianism of the moment, right? So in other words, the opponents of justice have a certain Machiavellian ingenuity that they're deploying against the armies of civil resistance in this moment that can be frustrating. So this text is incredibly important. Why? Because it speaks to what we need to do, how we need to think about our work. It gives us both historical context, an empirical basis, I would argue some normative direction, some moral direction. This is critically important. Last point here. Many times, some of my colleagues confine their wisdom, confine their scholarship to peer-reviewed journals. That's certainly important. But why should it be the scholars have a monopoly on the strategies, on the theories that can help change the world? My colleague has spoken to this moment, which is why I'm excited about the book and welcome your thinking and insights in terms of the work ahead.
I can't breathe. It hurts. Those were the last words of 15-year-old Alvaro, who was murdered in 2018 in Nicaragua by pro-government forces of Daniel Ortega. They might sound familiar to many of us who have been following events in the US surrounding Black Lives Matter, surrounding movements and justice coming from the ground up. And what does that have to do with Erica and her work? I met Erica in 2012. I had just finished a PhD program. I thought I was going to be an academic, but I knew I wanted to write. And I had a discussion with Erica and I read her book, and that work has marked everything that I'm doing to this day, because that's what kind of power her work has. It stayed with me, and the choices that I've made, the kind of stories that I'm telling. And I don't specifically cover movements. I write about immigration. I write about women's rights. I write about labor rights, but often these are issues that involve movements. And her work really showed me the power of nonviolent organizing and gave me a way to discuss it, because every time I'm writing about these issues, like when I was in Nicaragua in 2018, people are telling me we need to meet violence with violence. And I'm talking, if I'm having a beer, if I'm talking to an academic, if everyone eventually tells me they think that violence needs to be met with violence. And so having an answer for that, which involves Erica's book, or even giving them Erica's book or recommending them Erica's book, is part of what I do. And the reason that I went to Nicaragua is very much related to Erica's work. She may not know this at all, but I was on the US-Mexico border in 2018 working on a story, and I interviewed some migrants, women from Nicaragua who were fleeing Nicaragua, mothers whose children had been murdered by government forces. Many of them were protesting social inequalities. The protests really came out of an issue related to pensions for the retired. So it seems kind of like a calm issue, but it wasn't. The government started killing people and children, a lot of children, and that. So I went to Nicaragua to see what these mothers were doing, because the mothers started organizing. They organized a movement called the Mothers of April, and I wanted to cover it. And I went on my own, and I sold the story later, and it was pretty complicated, but it was work that I knew needed to be done and that I wanted to do. And part of that is really a belief rooted in things that I learned from talking to Erica and from reading her work. So I want to thank you all for being here. I love this group. It's a really diverse and interesting group of people, and I'm excited to see you all even virtually.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Erica, for sending your book. And it was just, it'll remain an important part of my life in terms of, and thank you, Hardy, because it was Hardy who told me about Erica for the first time. And I was really excited to know her and know their work. And thank you, Professor Brooks, for calling out that the thin line between academia and what we do on the ground is so important. That every time, I mean, because I work in the cusp of both, but a lot of scholarship also tries to decry that, oh, you are just an activist, so just like stay away. And you have to think. So I'm so glad that Erica's book has actually crossed that threshold for all of us. So thank you. And so most importantly, congratulations, Erica, for this amazing work. And it's going to be a good handbook for many of us. And if I was given a little chance to edit your book, I could have called it, however, as People's Resistance, What Everyone Needs to Do. Because every one of us needs to work on this. For me, I will take the two angles of looking at it in terms of scholarship, as well as in terms of bringing the activism like Alice and many of earlier colleagues have spoken about. I love how you have defined and do the historical analysis of civil resistance, that it has historical roots, but it was Mahatma Gandhi, the land I come from, which sort of made it more prominent in terms of that the word, and quoting page number 210, Gandhi used the term civil resistance as a mashup of two words, civil disobedience and passive resistance. I grew up hearing about civil disobedience. So it took me a while to sort of get into civil resistance part. And thanks to your book, I'm like, in terms of the clarity, the book is really clear in terms of defining what is civil resistance. And you have done it so well in, I think, in defining it as a method of active conflict in which unarmed people use a variety of coordinated, non-institutional methods, strikes, protests, demonstration, boycotts, alternative institution building, and many other techniques to promote change without harming or threatening to harm an opponent. So this is the definition from your book, and I found it useful to understand that a lot of people think civil resistance is non-violent action. And you have clearly said that it is not the case. It is one of the issues. However, I was a little bit skeptical about the word civil, because when you look at the dictionary meaning of civil, it means be courteous, be polite. And when we do activism, and I have done this for 15 years of my life, we are anything but that, because we are trying to get a body from the mortuary, trying to get the police to file a first information report, get the governor or the chief minister to agree to our demands, and we are not anything but civil in that. So, and I was also, as I mentioned, in terms of looking at the historicity of what is civility, I'm a little bit worried in the sense like we have a world which is highly weaponized. Like America has 800 military stations all over the world. And the government of India has imposed 300,000 army in Manipur, where I come from, where an armed martial law has been imposed for the last 3 years. So trying to see, we want, and I am nonviolent in nature, I am practicing civil resistance, but when you see a lot of like what is called the governmentality of killing, which Foucault might use, then we feel really like, how do we buy into this? So I wish the book had more into how do we tackle these kind of really the panopticon, the violence which is over our lives in a way which is really, really lethal. I had also spoken once with you at class of one of your colleagues that Fanon saying that nonviolence is complicit with colonial violence, So that's again something that I felt really, really important. But you had beautifully mentioned also in your book that civil resistance is not necessarily about peaceful conflict resolution. It's the very real sense it constructively promotes conflict. So I was intrigued by that, how the goal of nonviolence, goal of civil resistance, as you wrote, page 4, is to affect the status quo. Civil resistance tends to seek change, often revolutionary ways within a broader society, unquote. For me, I was like, I wanted you to talk more about what are the revolutionary change that you have written in that book. I was intrigued how we can take things more out of that. And you mentioned very clearly that this book is not just about passive, submissive, inaction, peaceful, anything but that about the book. So, and you had also mentioned you had done a study of 50% of nonviolent revolutions from 1990 to 2019 have succeeded, while only 26% of violence have succeeded. But so it's more nonviolent. So is there any segregated data on how much of civil resistance as you defined have succeeded? I had this question in my mind. And, and again, one of the things is there are, according to some analysis, there are 21 reported conflicts in the world. And there are 370 plus unreported conflicts around the world. Manipur, where I come from in the Indo-Burma border, is one of those conflicts who have not been studied, not been analyzed. So I was wondering, what are the kind of, how do we sort of look into those kinds, so that in today's world of internet, where everything is at a Google search, but we also have so many unreported conflicts, and how do we bring their forms of resistance into the analysis is something which came to our mind. As you mentioned also very, very, very properly in that book, in today's world, data has suggested that in growing authoritarian regimes, more civil resistors have been jailed more than ever before. Last year, more than 390 plus human rights defenders, civil resistors were killed. And then we have a more growing criminalization of our politics. And you mentioned that data suggests governments are defeating revolutionary nonviolent movements more often than in prior decades. That is what is worrying, and how do we prepare ourselves for it? In India, the movement against Citizenship Amendment Act, currently the farmers' protest, the movement for the repeal of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act has been all, as you described, as civil resistance. But the government of India has refused to listen to the demands of millions of citizens. And you have attributed it to the rise of digital authoritarianism. I would add to it, the lies and disinformation campaign is what has also really hurt our movements. Erica, I think for me, I've seen so many movements, which are thousands and in millions, but it does not reach the headlines of New York Times or Washington Post the way we would analyze it. And finally, you mentioned Gene Sharp, whom I met in 2012, and he's known as a father of civil resistance studies. What is, I think, needed is who's the mother of, or what is the gendered approach to now civil resistance studies? Gene Sharp mentioned 198 methods of nonviolent action, and I actually adopted some of them. And when I taught a class on women, war, and peace, I actually worked with my students adopting some of the techniques. And finally, I will conclude by saying that I was recently reading actually Václav Havel's really beautiful essay from the ICNC website. It's called Power to the Powerlessness. And I was struck by the concepts he developed to give. In fact, your whole notion of civil resistance is about giving power to the powerlessness, to the indigenous, to the minorities, to the undocumented, human beings who have been left out of the narrative of nation states, that we are not treated equal citizens of an equal country or equal human beings on this global earth. And he speaks about what I really found useful was his concepts of living the truth, the audacity of civil resistors for us to live the truth, however utopic we may be, but continue to live that truth, because according to Havel, the post-totalitarian system is mounting, I mean, the current times that we're in. It's a total assault on humans, and humans stand against it alone, abandoned, and isolated. So this is what he said. So his concepts of who's a dissident, we are all dissidents here. And okay, and to end it, and to end again, there was a speech that Alexander Solzhenitsyn gave at Harvard. And he did talk about, and he did talk about the Western world has lost its civil courage, both as a whole and separately in each country, each government, and each political party, and at the United Nations. And we in the East haven't lost it. I have seen this willpower in the mothers of Manipur, in the women of Nicaragua, in the Guatemalan women, and also, and that's why we are now picking up the idea of today what I would call indigenous resistance. Thank you, Erica, and congratulations once again for your amazing work. We will continue to work together. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to see you all and to be on this panel. I'd like to start by echoing what others have said and just really congratulate and thank Erica for creating such an outstanding book. It is remarkable, and it brings together so much of the new research over the last decade, as well as what preceded it. But particularly in the last decade, there's been a major growth in research, some of which, of course, we know was done by Erica, and some of which builds on their work. So somebody had to write a book that brought that research and made it accessible to scholars and practitioners. But not just that. As Professor Brooks mentioned, we've seen the largest growth of new nonviolent movements around the world in the last decade, as for me, any other time in history that I can think of. Who would bring in those case accounts, those examples, those insights that we've learned over the last 10 plus years from practitioners and put it all into one book? The undertaking is huge. Erica has done it. It's a huge service. So thank you very much, Erica. Another thing that immediately struck me about the book that I loved is it goes straight to some of the gray areas. For example, like property destruction. What are its impacts on civil resistance movements? That's a topic on people's minds. And when they ask me about it, or others, I say, well, how long do you have? Because it's really complicated and this and that. But somehow Erica found a way to really incisively drill down on that and provide really great sort of guidance, research, and ways to, as they mentioned in the beginning, start the conversation. Similarly, questions of hacktivism and hacking and the ethics and strategy involved with civil resistance, I dodge that question. I'm like, when I say, well, let's deal with that later. I don't know yet. And you just laid it down really directly, really helpfully. And it's again, a really valuable service. Works like this book, they don't just add to our knowledge. They also can influence people's attitudes and behaviors in ways that create real world outcomes. And so I want to spend just a few minutes talking about that, because this is about more than knowledge. People have talked about the importance of studying it, practicing it, living it, and that's where I want to go. And so on this point, I'll draw a little bit from my work at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. We're an organization in Washington, D.C. that has spent years doing educational programming around civil resistance. And I'll draw on one program in particular in my comments. For the last 10 years, we've done an online course that's 6 or 7 weeks long, and attracts we accept about 50 people into that course from all over the world. And we do a lot of evaluation of that course because we want to know what people are learning, what the impacts it has, how does exposure to civil resistance knowledge, both from the course as well as from the interaction among the participants, how does this affect people? And I just want to hit on sort of a sample of top line findings and then bring it back to the impact of Erica's book. So the first thing that we find is that when people are exposed to information about civil resistance, they become more willing and more likely to engage in it, right? And this is so even when that information is not presented as encouragement, is not given as advice, but is simply presented as, here's the research, here are the case studies, here are exercises, here are insights from practitioners. If you put that out there and trust that people will know if or how or when to apply it in their own lives and wrestle with it themselves, without any encouragement and advice, we find it creates an attitude and behavior shift where people become more willing to do it. And I would guess because they become more confident that civil resistance can actually get results. Another key finding is that when people are exposed to knowledge about civil resistance, They report efficacy gains in their activism. They report increases in their strategic planning capacity. We get this finding year after year after year. Another, and I think really each of these points I think is really exciting in itself, is that after people are exposed to civil resistance knowledge, people report back to us that they're more likely to do their own self-directed study and reading about it. In other words, it plants a seed where people become curious and they want to learn more. And for some people, that becomes a larger journey. We also hear a lot from people that people are more likely to write about civil resistance after they've been exposed to this knowledge and share the knowledge through training and teaching others. A fourth point is that these effects that I'm talking about, they don't quickly diminish. So for example, after our online courses, we do a 3-month post-course evaluation. How's it going for you 3 months later? And one of my favorite findings is that a lot of people say, well, the knowledge about civil resistance is still as relevant, but between 1.25% of people say that actually the knowledge 3 months later, they find it even more relevant now than immediately after the course ended. So upon reflection, they find that information even like more useful. And actually, evaluation we've done of other programs, even a year later, shows that these effects continue a year and beyond. And then lastly, and this is really, I've seen this many times, and we all have, when people learn about civil resistance together, they tend to remain in touch and they tend to support each other afterwards. And that is, I think, half the value of any good workshop right there. It's the stuff that you can't plan. It's the stuff that you get people in the room and give the space, create the container, and they will make meaning of it. And the civil resistance provides a common conversation starter and set of concepts for them to suddenly be able to share a framework so that they can evaluate. So these are recurring results that I see in our work. And while I fully believe in my organization's efforts, I don't think that these results are unique to our work. These results reflect also a generic value to exposure to this field. What knowledge in this field does for people, regardless of how they get it, whether it's a workshop, a book, a course, or who they get it from. And so, in this vein, again, Erica's new book is a huge service. I expect that people reading this book is going to yield to these kinds of behavior shifts for people in the US and abroad. So I'll close just by saying thank you for the book, but thank you also for the impacts that I know it's going to have.
Thank you all for your wonderful remarks. I'm going to ask Erica to just respond briefly to the comments and reflections that have been shared by our guests, and then we're going to open it up to a Q&A. If you have questions in the audience, please post it in the chat and we will draw on some of the audience questions as well.
Thank you so much, Sushma, and thanks a lot, colleagues, for these really generous comments and engagements. So maybe I'll speak really quickly to the title and the term civil resistance. So I agree with you, Bina. It's a compromise. Perhaps a more generic description of this phenomenon would be people power. I like that better because it's a little bit more affirmative. It tells us exactly where the power lies. It tells us that it has to be more than one person in motion together. And I like that kind of terminology. It has a lot of connotation that's related to one particular campaign, though, which is the People Power movement in the Philippines. And so a lot of people associate it with one struggle. But I take your points and in fact try to address them in the book somewhat, that what I don't want to do is conjure images of civility, because the notion of civil resistance is really getting more to the idea that it's a collective civic engagement, that it is to some degree self-limiting, but that's a strategic choice. And it's really rooted in the fact that it's a collective action. And the term resistance is one that a lot of people also have something of an allergy to, because it suggests that people are always on the defensive rather than, engaging and taking initiative toward transforming a system without needing to resist something. And so I actually think that the term has some trouble, but is also one of the more accessible ones out there that brings less baggage along than some of the others. For example, the term nonviolence, many people either confuse or caricature, and that can also kind of create a sense of confusion about what we're actually talking about. And so the term civil resistance seems to be the most accessible, the easiest to translate without key elements of the definition getting lost in translation. But I take the critiques. The second thing I wanted to speak to is this issue of digital authoritarianism, disinformation, and the problem of truth. And it's Václav Havel for sure, but it's also Gandhi, whose autobiography is called Experiments in Truth, right? Because so much about the practice of nonviolent action, civil resistance, and the quest for justice more generally is about truth. And so I think that this age in which we not only have viral disinformation, but we have viral disinformation that's targeted to different people, depending on who they hang out with, what types of items they buy online, where they spend their time in their town, and what they're doing. The fact that it can be targeted into people's pockets, literally, in their cell phones, I think puts us in a situation that we have never seen before. So it's hard to find comparable historical reference points for where we are today in that regard. It's not difficult to find comparable historical reference points for propaganda, right? Because that's been a major part of how authoritarian governments have attempted to maintain power, is through spreading lies, is through, basically trumping up fake charges and jailing people. That's always been part of the toolkit. But I do agree with you that the sort of massive diffusion of disinformation does create alternate realities that are largely segregated from one another and don't actually have common reference points. And that does make it very difficult. I wish we could bring back some of the early practitioners of nonviolent resistance to get their opinion about this, the novelty of it, and what we might do about it. But I do think that it's very troubling, and Hardy said he dodges the hacktivism thing. I dodge the disinformation thing. I haven't thought through it yet in terms of the implications and the complexity of it, because of the fact that most of it, at least in this country, is driven by market algorithms rather than a deliberate attempt by the state. And then the third thing I just wanted to address briefly before turning it over is your incredibly important question, Bina, about who the mother of civil resistance studies is. I'd be curious to hear what the panelists would say about this. But in terms of my initial kind of thought about this was that it's hard to pick one, which is also a gendered response, right? And I think that basically the three that I would point to would be people like Ella Baker, people like Barbara Deming, and people like Hannah Arendt, actually, if you want a theoretician in there, whose work very much inspired Gene Sharp's. But I don't know. I don't think the field has acknowledged its mothers or a full range of parents. And I do think that there's there's definitely a growing opportunity in the field to pay more attention, not just to women in civil resistance as a field and as a practice, but also to understand gender and all its complexity, and particularly the way that it intersects with other identities and oppressions in ways that the field has yet to fully, I think, develop. But certainly there are many working on these areas now, and I think that that's going to be the next the next big push in the field.
Thank you so much. So I'm wondering, Erica, could you define success in civil resistance for us? This is a question from the audience. And what are some key elements of successful civil resistance campaigns?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So there are basically narrow and broad ways to define success. The narrowest way is to gauge whether the movement achieved what it said it wanted. And then there's also questions about the long-term impacts of a movement getting what it wants. That is to say, whether it's a durable outcome. And then there are lots of other ways that people try to assess movements in terms of whether they actually produce shared progress in many different domains. So for example, not just did they overthrow a government, but did they also lead to more egalitarian political, economic, and social change? Did they yield greater experiences of justice or access to justice by a broader range of people in the society, et cetera? And so the book covers lots of research that defines the outcomes of these movements in all of these ways. I think one of the areas in which there can be some disagreement because of a mismatch on how people gauge success or the outcomes of movements is in the area of the effects of violence on movements, that is particularly violence used by some within the movement, because many proponents of, or at least people who defend violence by movements will often say that it got the movement more success, that it put the issue on the agenda, that it saved people's lives, et cetera. And those are true often, but they're also what we would call process goals, that they're sort of tactical outcomes. And then there's the question of what about the long-term political game? And that's where you see that sometimes the tactical impacts backfire politically, and that it costs the movement in the longer term in terms of its ability to actually create political change. And so I think the question of success and outcomes is super important, because if we don't identify what we mean when we talk about the outcomes or the success, we can talk past each other very easily when we're talking about different types of tactical and strategic choices.
Thank you. I'm wondering if I could ask you and Professor Brooks and anyone else on the panel who'd like to respond to this, your assessment of the past year in terms of responding to the killings of African Americans by police as well as armed vigilantes. We've seen an outpouring of support by people going to the streets, protesting and demanding change around the country in small towns as well. And you've, of course, researched and written on this, and Cornell has spoken on this. And I'm wondering your assessment of sort of some wins or things where there have been progress or success, impact, and areas where we still have to work or focus on looking forward.
Maybe Cornell can speak to this first.
Sure. I think some of the progress and frustration speaks to the importance of a couple of themes lifted up in the book. So in terms of progress, the fact that we have a state like Maryland taking on the Police Bill of Rights and checking qualified immunity, that is on the table, constraining the ability of police officers to take people's lives with legal cover. The fact that we have the question of defunding the police beside the question of reimagining policing. In other words, reimagining policing serving as a proxy for going back to community policing. So there are more policy options on the table, which I think speaks to Professor Chenoweth's challenge in the book of, namely, we have many more people on the street, but the range of civil resistance is not as broad as one might imagine. It is certainly broader than it has been in the past, but I believe activists are grappling with how do we expand the range of options sought, the justice goals sought, even as we expand the range of the means to pursue the end, particularly in the wake of this digital disinformation campaign, authoritarianism. And the last point here is, as I saw as CEO of the NAACP, when you hit the street, the other people hit you online. They take down your character. They go after your sources. They go after your funding. So this is a very, very sophisticated assault where the algorithms make it more effective, but you still have people who are pulling the levers. So that would be my observation. It's a moment of optimism, but I think the book points to some serious cautionary notes.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it shouldn't be underappreciated that the intensity and novelty of having 25 to 26 million people in this country participate in what was the largest and most enduring mass mobilization in the history of our country. The question always is, what are the material effects of that? And I think it's just simply too soon to know. Usually these types of things take more time to sort of unfold. And we see so much unfolding now. We see, you know, HR 40 being taken seriously, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and we see reparations not only being taken up by city councils, by states, by corporations, by universities, by even the federal government, but we see them being paid out. And Denver just paid out some of its first reparations in a negotiated agreement with Native American communities there this past week. We see serious conversation about abolition. We see serious conversation about reparations. We see major and enduring public opinion shifts about the importance of racial justice in the country as like a primary defining issue that needs addressing. We see organizational infrastructure skyrocketing for organizations and movements who are trying to align around these issues that really increases their capacity for long-term transformation. We've seen the electoral power of this movement, not just in the 2020 general elections, but also in other special elections that were held over the summer, which saw, for example, the first Black woman mayor of Ferguson elected in Missouri. So, you know, I think what is always easy to do is to take a look at where a movement says it's trying to go, to look at it 6 months after it happened and say, let's judge it against where it's trying to go, and feel very defeated and resigned. But imagine what the country might look like if it hadn't happened. And that actually can help us understand, you know, why it's so important and how it's so important when people stand up.
Thank you.
If I may,
Sorry.
oh no, no worries.
Go ahead, Erica.
I was just, if I could just jump in real quick. I think I resonated a lot with this, and one of the observations that many of us have had in Arizona, you know, as some of you saw during the election in 2020, Arizona was a big surprise to a lot of people on how the state, you know, went from 10 years ago, 12 years ago, totally one of the most anti-immigrant states. You know, we basically flipped it from Republican to Democrat in the Senate. And a lot of us here in the state who have been working on immigrant rights work and who saw the uprising of people in 2010 in response to a lot of these anti-immigrant laws, we're really just trying to like look back and realize, a lot of us, that the change happened, but it happened many, like we started seeing it many years later, right? Where a lot of the uprising created new leaders, and new leaders created new organizations, and new organization created more civil resistance and more engagement, and over time, 10 years later, right, we were able to, and you know, we don't have to call this the actual success of it, flipping the state, because we also have to move our, you know, our democratic leaders to get what we need and what we want for our people. But in terms of what we have seen on the ground is that it did have, having thousands of people marching in the streets in 2010 against a lot of these attacks did create a ripple effect that through time we were able to see the changes in our communities. In some, we still have a lot to go, but we have seen some of the changes.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask Hardy a question around framing. We touched on this earlier with Bina's comment about the use of the term civil. Erica touched on this in the context of their framing and using the word nonviolence versus civil resistance. And, I see that you co-authored this groundbreaking report entitled Preventing Mass Atrocities from a Responsibility to Protect to a Right to Assist Campaigns of Civil Resistance. So given the leadership role you've played in this field for so long, I'm wondering about this pivot from sort of responding, passively or responding after the fact to proactively mobilizing people to preempt future atrocities. So what is your thinking about ways in which movements can frame their messages to get through to both the leaders, but also the public?
Thank you. And cognizant of time, I'll try to keep it very short. The first thing that I think that drove that report in part was Erica's groundbreaking research in 2011 with Why Civil Resistance Works. If we really follow the data to where it leads, the efficacy rates and the differential in efficacy rates between nonviolent resistance versus violent insurgency is unignorable. And another thing that's unignorable is the relationship between civil resistance and democratic gains. Research result that's been replicated more than half a dozen times in the last decade, which really needs to be taken seriously. So at a time of rising authoritarianism, where we have 15 consecutive years at least of democratic decline and rising authoritarianism, which to me is not just a moral crisis, it's a strategic crisis. It's a national security threat. It guarantees a less stable world. It guarantees a world where violent conflict is more likely. If we're gonna take that seriously and say, how do we prevent violent conflict? How do we prevent, especially violent conflict where atrocities are most likely to happen? We have to look at governance and we have to say, well, we have to push back on authoritarianism in some way. And yes, for sure, authoritarian governments that are categorically abusive to their people, but also the weaknesses in democracies and semi-democracies where authoritarianism lurks in virtually every country. Because those spots can quickly metastasize, can quickly become areas that are exploited by demagogues to continue to damage democracy. So the argument here is that we in the international community, to the extent that I'm operating outside the United States, need to have movements at the center of our analysis for how we create a more peaceful world and how we can support a less violent world and a world of fewer atrocities. And I think, activists overseas have their hands so full, and few of them have the direct line access needed to reach members of the international community who really need to hear from them. And so in part, I see the role of universities and NGOs as being the bridge builders who carry that message. It's a case that I want to make constantly, and it's a case that this book makes. It's a case that I know others on this panel have made, that we need to take movements seriously, figure out how better to support them. Authoritarians take them very seriously and want to repress them and are teaming up now against movements. On the other side, those who sympathize with them, whether they're states or organizations or universities or transnational solidarity groups, we need to come forward strongly together and say we have a right to provide certain forms of support. And on that note, I'll just hit a plug for Erica. One of her most recent research projects, which was published by ICNC, finds that training was one of the most effective ways to support movements, which can be done well before a movement hits its peak. It can be done proactively, and it can have real impacts later on. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I know we're out of time, but I'm wondering whether I can call on Alice and Erica in perhaps one sentence to share, given the transition from a Trump administration to a Biden-Harris administration, how do you see the need to maintain momentum for the immigrant rights movement? Because some of the most horrific acts are being rolled back. So how do you maintain that momentum for other types of changes that are essential?
I'll just try it real quick and then I'll give space. I think we have to keep speaking the truth to what is actually happening to the community, focusing on the truth and the people, and not necessarily just on the political leaders. You know, there's still deportations happening, detention centers are still open. There's still children who are right now in custody of the government, thousands of them. And to me, what is important is to continue to remind people that human beings are still in the line, right? And that a democratic president, it hasn't end all the problems in the country and the world, right? That it's going to be us. So that's what we're going to continue to do in Raíces and the organization that I work for, hoping that we can keep on yeah, just reminding people that these injustices are still happening, and that now we have more power to change it, because we were part of the election of the new president. Many of us were.
In terms of my work as a journalist and thinking about immigration and how it's covered, I think what Erica said is really important in terms of keeping the focus on people. And I just returned from the Mexico-Guatemala border, and I think it's really interesting because I was on the Mexico-Guatemala border interviewing unaccompanied migrant minors, so children age 3 to 17. And I was looking at the news in the US. The news in the US is border crisis, overwhelmed, sea of people, all this language that is military and or racist, and that really doesn't get to the point. So in my interviews, what did I find out from these children? Some of them had been orphaned by 2 hurricanes that came through Central America during the pandemic, Eta and Iota. So for me, immigration is about climate change. Is it about Biden? Is it about Trump? I mean, in a very secondary way. That is never going to be my focus. My focus is going to be on the big picture, which we seem to not want to, address because it's more complicated. And that's what I think is really important about Erica's research, is that she takes things that are complex and she breaks them down in a way that you can understand, explain, and implement them. And that is people power.
Thank you so much, everybody, for spending this hour talking about these ideas. I really appreciate you accepting the invitation, and Sushma and Matthias for hosting, and Larissa for your able moderation of the event. And yeah, just thanks again so much. It's been just a real privilege to hear what you